Picture this. It's July 1831, and 22-year-old Cyrus McCormick is standing in his father's blacksmith shop in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. But this isn't just any blacksmith shop, this is a graveyard of dreams. Scattered around him are the twisted, rusted remains of 22 years' worth of failed experiments. Broken gears, bent iron rods, splintered wooden frames, each piece a testament to his father's obsession with solving what seemed like an impossible problem. Outside that sweltering shop, the July sun is beating down mercilessly on endless fields of golden wheat. And there, spread across those fields like an army in desperate battle, are 300 of McCormick's neighbors. Men, women, even children, all of them bent over with scythes, racing against time itself. Because here's the thing that modern people don't really understand about the 1800s. When harvest time came, it wasn't just work. It was war. War against nature. War against time. War against starvation itself. You see, wheat doesn't wait for human convenience. When it's ready, it's ready. Miss that narrow window, maybe 2 weeks if you're lucky, and your entire year's food supply rots on the stalk. Imagine your entire family's survival depending on cutting acres upon acres of grain with nothing but a curved blade and human muscle. Now imagine you're racing against weather that could destroy everything with one good storm. McCormick watched as a pregnant woman collapsed from exhaustion, right there in the field. Her husband had to carry her to the shade of an oak tree, while their unharvested wheat, their children's winter bread, withered in the relentless sun. This wasn't unusual. This was July in farming country. People died during harvest. Hearts gave out. Backs broke. Families went hungry because there simply weren't enough human hands and hours to bring in the grain before nature reclaimed it. That night, by the flickering light of a single candle, something extraordinary happened. Young Cyrus McCormick sat down with paper and charcoal and began sketching a design that would break every rule of farming that had existed since the dawn of civilization. What he drew that night was either pure genius or complete madness. His neighbors would soon decide which. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand the McCormick family itself. These weren't ordinary farmers scratching out a living in the Virginia hills. The McCormicks were Scotch-Irish immigrants who had brought something special with them across the Atlantic. A Presbyterian belief that improving God's creation wasn't just acceptable, it was a moral duty. Robert McCormick, Cyrus's father, had spent literally decades trying to build a mechanical reaper. Think about that level of obsession. This man had been failing at the same impossible dream since before Cyrus was even born. Year after year, Robert would emerge from his blacksmith shop with some new contraption, test it in the fields, watch it break apart or jam up or simply not work, then drag the pieces back to start over again. Most people would have given up. Most people would have accepted that harvesting grain was just something humans had to do with their backs and their hands, the way it had been done since the ancient Egyptians. But Robert McCormick had that particular kind of stubborn genius that refuses to accept impossible. And more importantly, he had a son who had been watching every failure, learning from every mistake. Young Cyrus had been Robert's shadow in that blacksmith shop since he could walk. While other boys played with wooden toys, Cyrus was studying the mechanics of cutting blades, the physics of moving grain, the engineering challenges that had defeated his father again and again. Every broken machine was a lesson. Every failed harvest trial was education that no university could provide. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Cyrus wasn't just copying his father's work, he was secretly revolutionizing it. Late at night, when the rest of the family slept, young McCormick would slip out to the barn with his own tools and his own ideas. He took his father's basic cutting mechanism. That part actually worked pretty well, but then he added something that changed everything. A revolving reel. Stay with me here, because this simple addition was like adding wings to a cart. Traditional scythes just cut the grain and left it lying there in messy piles. You still had to gather it by hand, bundle it, stack it all, back-breaking work that took almost as long as the cutting itself. But McCormick's revolving reel would sweep the cut grain directly onto a platform as the machine moved forward, cut and gather in one smooth operation. His neighbors thought he was insane. Here was this young man, barely out of his teens, claiming he could build a machine that would do the work of 6 men with scythes. In 1831, that was like claiming you could fly to the moon. It wasn't just unlikely, it was against the natural order of things. But Cyrus McCormick had something his skeptical neighbors didn't have. He had 22 years' worth of his father's failures to build upon. He knew exactly what didn't work and why. More importantly, he had that uniquely American combination of engineering skill and complete disregard for conventional wisdom. Working with scrap iron and whatever wood he could find, McCormick built his first crude machine in the family barn. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before, a strange combination of wheels and blades and rotating mechanisms that seemed to have been designed by someone from another planet. The cutting bar stretched 7 feet wide. The revolving reel swept around like a water wheel. The whole contraption was designed to be pulled by a single horse while one man guided it through the grain. As word spread through the Virginia countryside about young McCormick's invention, the reactions ranged from curiosity to outright mockery. Most farmers had seen enough contraptions fail to be deeply skeptical. After all, if mechanical reaping was possible, wouldn't someone have figured it out centuries ago? The Romans were brilliant engineers if they couldn't do it. What made this Virginia farm boy think he could? But Cyrus McCormick wasn't thinking about the Romans. He was thinking about that pregnant woman collapsing in the wheat field. He was thinking about families going hungry because human hands couldn't move fast enough to beat the weather. He was thinking about breaking the ancient cycle of backbreaking labor that had trapped farmers since the beginning of time. The real test was coming. McCormick had arranged to demonstrate his machine at neighbor John Steele's farm. Word had spread throughout the county, and farmers were planning to travel from miles around to watch what most expected would be a spectacular and probably amusing failure. Young McCormick spent the final nights before the demonstration making last-minute adjustments to his machine, knowing that everything, his reputation, his family's honor, maybe even the future of farming itself, would be decided in a single afternoon. Either his mad idea would work, or he would join the long list of dreamers who had tried and failed to mechanize the harvest. But as he made those final preparations, Cyrus McCormick had no idea that he was about to trigger a revolution that would transform not just farming, but the entire course of human civilization. His simple machine would free millions from backbreaking labor, feed growing cities, enable massive immigration, and ultimately change what it meant to be human in the modern world. The question was, would it even work? The morning of July 22nd, 1831, dawned with the kind of ominous weather that makes farmers nervous and inventors terrified. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, thick, dark thunderheads that promised either a gentle rain or a crop-destroying deluge. For Cyrus McCormick, standing beside his mechanical contraption in John Steele's wheat field, those clouds might as well have been omens of doom. 50 skeptical farmers had gathered to witness what most of them expected would be a spectacular failure. These weren't casual observers, these were men whose backs ached from decades of scythe work, whose hands were permanently scarred from handling grain, whose entire understanding of the world was built on the simple fact that harvesting required human muscle and nothing else. McCormick's reaper sat among them like an alien artifact, all angles and mechanisms where there should have been simple, familiar tools. Picture the scene. Here's this strange machine, 7 feet of cutting bar mounted on wheels, with a revolving reel that looked like something a madman might dream up. The farmers gathered around it like they were examining a dangerous animal. They poked at the gears, tested the sharpness of the blade, muttered among themselves about the foolishness of youth and the impossibility of what young McCormick was claiming. But Cyrus McCormick wasn't paying attention to the skeptics. His eyes were fixed on those gathering storm clouds. Weather had always been the farmer's enemy, but today it would either vindicate 22 years of his family's obsession or humiliate him in front of everyone who mattered in his community. As thunder rumbled overhead, fitting weather for revolution, you might say McCormick climbed onto his machine and gave the signal to move forward. What happened next changed everything. The reaper lurched into motion, pulled by a single horse, while McCormick guided it from his perch. The cutting blade began its chattering dance through the wheat stalks, while the revolving reel swept the cut grain onto the platform in one smooth, continuous motion. The sound was unlike anything those farmers had ever heard. not the whisper of scythes through grain, but the mechanical rhythm of progress itself. 6 acres fell that day. 6 acres. Think about what that means in human terms. 6 men working from dawn to dusk with scythes might complete that much work if they were lucky and the weather held. McCormick's machine, guided by 1 man and pulled by 1 horse, accomplished the same task in a fraction of the time. But here's what's really extraordinary about that moment. As those farmers watched McCormick's reaper cut through the wheat with mechanical precision, they weren't just witnessing a successful invention, they were watching the end of 10,000 years of human history. Since the first agricultural settlements in Mesopotamia, harvesting grain had meant bending your back and using your hands. In one afternoon, in one Virginia field, that ancient reality simply ceased to exist. The crowd's mood shifted from skepticism to stunned silence, to something approaching awe. These weren't men easily impressed by novelty, but they understood work. They understood what they were seeing, human labor being replaced by mechanical efficiency. Some of them probably felt the same mix of excitement and terror that factory workers would feel decades later when they first saw assembly lines. But invention, as McCormick would soon discover, was only the beginning of his war, because while he was perfecting his reaper in the Virginia hills, another man had been working on the exact same problem. Enter Obed Hussey, a name that should ring through history alongside McCormick's, because their rivalry would define the next 30 years of agricultural innovation. Hussey was a Quaker inventor from Ohio who had developed his own mechanical reaper just months before McCormick's successful demonstration. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting, because Hussey wasn't some amateur tinkerer. He was a brilliant engineer who had actually received his patent before McCormick. In the cold logic of intellectual property law, Hussey had the stronger claim to being the reaper's true inventor. What followed was one of the most bitter and consequential rivalries in American business history. McCormick versus Hussey, Virginia Presbyterian versus Ohio Quaker. 2 men, 2 machines, 2 completely different visions of how to mechanize the harvest and who should profit from it. Their battles played out everywhere in harvest fields where farmers compared the machines side by side, in courtrooms where patent lawyers argued over who had invented what first, in newspaper columns where each man's supporters published testimonials and attacked their rival's character. This wasn't just business competition. This was personal. McCormick and Hussey genuinely hated each other with the kind of passion usually reserved for blood feuds. But Cyrus McCormick had something Obed Hussey lacked: strategic genius that went far beyond mechanical engineering. While Hussey focused on perfecting his machine, McCormick was thinking about markets, distribution, and the broader forces reshaping America. And in 1847, McCormick made the decision that would determine the winner of their rivalry. He abandoned the tradition-bound East and moved his entire operation to Chicago. Think about how radical this was. Chicago in 1847 was barely more than a frontier town, muddy streets, wooden buildings, more of a glorified trading post than a manufacturing center. But McCormick had looked at a map and seen something his competitors missed: the vast western prairies stretching beyond the horizon, millions of acres of grassland just waiting to be turned into wheat fields. The East Coast had small farms, established ways of doing things, farmers who had been using scythes for generations and weren't necessarily eager to change. But the West was different. Out there, individual farmers were claiming sections of land that dwarfed entire eastern counties. A single homesteader might be responsible for harvesting hundreds of acres. You simply could not work land on that scale with traditional hand tools. The Western farmers didn't just want McCormick's reaper, they desperately needed it. From his new Chicago factory, McCormick began shipping reapers across the growing railway network to farmers throughout the Midwest and Great Plains. Each machine that rolled out of his factory was an ambassador for a new way of life, a mechanical evangelist preaching the gospel of efficiency to farmers who had never imagined that harvesting could be anything other than back-breaking labor. But McCormick's true moment of triumph came at the 1851 Great Exhibition in London, the first World's Fair, where nations from around the globe displayed their finest achievements for international judgment. McCormick had shipped his reaper across the Atlantic to compete against the best agricultural machinery that Europe could produce. The British reception was, let's call it sceptical. The London Times, the most influential newspaper in the English-speaking world, took one look at McCormick's contraption and dismissed it as a cross between a flying machine and a wheelbarrow. British engineers, proud inheritors of the Industrial Revolution, couldn't believe that some colonial farmer from the American frontier could teach them anything about machinery. The harvest trials were held at Tiptree Hall in Essex, and the British had prepared a challenge designed to humble the upstart American. The field they chose was a nightmare wet, tangled grain that had been beaten down by recent storms, the kind of conditions where even experienced scythemen struggled to work effectively. Every British machine that attempted the field either jammed, broke down, or simply couldn't handle the difficult conditions. Then came McCormick's turn. His reaper cut through that twisted, storm-damaged field like it was, a perfectly manicured lawn. While British machines failed one after another, McCormick's American invention worked with mechanical precision, gathering the wet grain onto its platform while the revolving reel kept everything moving smoothly. The crowd of skeptical Europeans watched in stunned silence as this cross between a flying machine and a wheelbarrow accomplished what their finest machinery could not. The aftermath was immediate and global. Orders poured in from European nobility who had witnessed the demonstration. Russian princes wanted reapers for their vast estates. German farmers demanded to know how they could purchase the American machine. French agricultural societies invited McCormick to demonstrate his reaper throughout the countryside. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when the London Times published a retraction. The same newspaper that had mocked McCormick's invention as a bizarre contraption now praised it as a triumph of American mechanical genius. The reaper that had been dismissed as a wheelbarrow was suddenly being hailed as the future of agriculture. Obed Hussey never recovered from that London triumph. While McCormick was conquering international markets and building a global reputation, Hussey remained focused on technical improvements to his machine. It wasn't enough. By the 1860s, McCormick had essentially won their decades-long rivalry, not because his machine was necessarily superior, but because he understood that invention without marketing is just clever tinkering. The storm clouds that had gathered over John Steele's field on that July morning in 1831 had indeed been omens not of McCormick's failure, but of a revolution that would transform agriculture forever. What started as one young man's mad idea had become an international phenomenon that was already reshaping how humanity fed itself. But McCormick's story was far from over. His greatest challenges and his most profound impact on American society still lay ahead. By 1860, Cyrus McCormick ruled his mechanical empire from a sprawling factory complex in Chicago that hummed with the sound of progress itself. Steam-powered hammers shaped iron into cutting blades. Assembly lines, a concept that would later make Henry Ford famous, churned out reapers at a pace that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. McCormick had become something entirely new in American history, an industrial merchant prince whose kingdom was built not on land or gold, but on the liberation of human labor. But here's what makes McCormick's story truly extraordinary. His real revolution wasn't happening in that Chicago factory. It was occurring in farmhouses scattered across the American heartland, in places where his machines had transformed not just how people worked, but how they lived, how they dreamed, and what they believed was possible for their children. Consider the letter that survives in McCormick's Business Archives, written in 1862 by a woman named Sarah Chen, a pioneer widow whose husband had died of fever, leaving her alone with 3 young children and a homestead claim of 40 acres in Nebraska Territory. In her careful handwriting, she wrote, "Mr. McCormick, your machine saved my family. With my husband dead and no money to hire help, I thought we would lose everything. But with your reaper, I harvested 40 acres alone. My children will not go hungry this winter, and we will keep our land." Sarah Chen's story wasn't unique. It was being repeated in thousands of variations across the expanding frontier. McCormick's reaper had done something that no previous technology in human history had accomplished. It had made it possible for a single person to work vast amounts of land effectively. A widow with a McCormick reaper could outproduce a team of strong men working with scythes. That wasn't just mechanical efficiency, that was a complete reordering of social possibility. But McCormick understood that even the most revolutionary machine was worthless if farmers couldn't afford to buy it. A reaper cost about $150 more than many families saw in cash during an entire year. So McCormick invented something almost as revolutionary as the reaper itself: the installment plan. $100 down, the rest payable after harvest. Think about what this meant in a cash-poor agricultural economy. Traditional credit required farmers to deal with banks, put up their land as collateral, and risk losing everything if crops failed. McCormick's installment plan was entirely different. It linked his success directly to the farmer's success. If the harvest was good, everyone prospered. If it failed, McCormick absorbed the loss. "Pay with wheat," McCormick declared, and suddenly credit itself was transformed. Farmers could essentially trade future grain for present machinery. McCormick was betting his fortune on American agriculture, and American farmers were betting their future on McCormick's machines. It was a partnership that created wealth on both sides and bound McCormick's interests permanently to the prosperity of American farming. This wasn't just smart business, it was a completely new model for industrial capitalism. Instead of extracting wealth from farmers, McCormick was creating wealth with them. His reapers increased productivity so dramatically that farmers could easily afford the payments while still earning more than they ever had with traditional methods. Everyone won, and the entire American economy began to benefit from this multiplication of agricultural efficiency. But then came 1861, and everything changed. The Civil War brought moral complexity to McCormick's mechanical empire that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Here's the terrible irony. McCormick's reapers became crucial weapons in the Union war effort, but McCormick himself sympathized with the Confederacy. His machines freed Northern farmers to join the Union Army while still maintaining the food production necessary to feed that same army. Union recruiters would literally visit farming communities and tell young men, "Buy a McCormick reaper for your family, then come fight for the Union. Your farm will keep producing while you're gone." McCormick watched with conflicted feelings as his own invention helped sustain the war effort against the South he privately supported. Every reaper sold in the North was another soldier freed from farming duty. Every bushel of grain harvested by his machines was another meal for Union troops. His mechanical children were fighting a war he didn't believe in. The complexity deepened when we consider McCormick's relationship with his wife, Nancy "Nettie" Fowler McCormick, a brilliant woman whose story deserves to be far better known. Nettie wasn't just the wife of an industrial titan. She was a partner who often managed the company during Cyrus's frequent travels and whose business acumen may have exceeded even his own. When Cyrus was traveling to demonstrate reapers or fight patent battles, Nettie ran the Chicago operation with an iron hand and a keen mind for both details and strategy. She understood manufacturing efficiency, worker relations, and financial management in ways that would have impressed any captain of industry. More importantly, she understood the human cost of their success in ways that sometimes escaped her husband. Nettie McCormick was also a committed abolitionist whose moral clarity contrasted sharply with her husband's Confederate sympathies. Their dinner-table conversations during the Civil War must have been extraordinary, the woman who opposed slavery arguing with the man whose machines were helping to end it, even as he wished the war would stop and the Union would leave the South alone. But Nettie's greatest test came on October 8, 1871, when the Great Chicago Fire swept through the city like a biblical judgment. Everything McCormick had built, the massive factory, the corporate offices, even their elegant mansion, was reduced to ash and twisted metal in a single night. Standing in the smoldering ruins of 20 years of work, many men would have surrendered to despair. McCormick was 62 years old, theoretically wealthy, but with most of his assets literally burned to the ground. He could have retired, moved back to Virginia, lived quietly on whatever remained of his fortune. Instead, Nettie McCormick took charge. Within days, not weeks or months, but days, she had secured emergency loans from Eastern banks, identified new factory sites, and begun negotiations to purchase the land where McCormick's rebuilt empire would rise. While her husband dealt with insurance claims and supplier contracts, Nettie orchestrated the resurrection of their business with an efficiency that impressed even Chicago's hardened financial community. The new factory that rose from the ashes was larger and more sophisticated than what the fire had destroyed. Steam-powered machinery replaced older equipment. Production lines were redesigned for greater efficiency. By 1873, McCormick's Chicago factory was producing 500 reapers daily, more than his original facility had produced in a month. But the fire had taught both McCormick something crucial about the fragility of physical assets and the importance of diversification. They began licensing their technology to manufacturers in other countries, spreading McCormick reapers across global markets while reducing their dependence on any single facility. By the time Cyrus McCormick died in his Chicago mansion on May 13, 1884, his machines were harvesting grain on every continent where agriculture was practiced. Australian settlers used McCormick reapers to turn bush into wheat fields. Argentine gauchos guided them across the vast pampas. Russian peasants operated them on steppes that stretched beyond the horizon. In the American West, McCormick's reapers had enabled the cultivation of the Great Plains, that enormous grassland that earlier generations had dismissed as the Great American Desert. What had seemed like useless prairie was transformed into the world's most productive agricultural region, feeding not just America but much of the world. The economic impact was staggering. Agricultural productivity had increased so dramatically that America went from importing grain to becoming the world's largest food exporter. Cities exploded in size as former farm workers moved to manufacturing jobs. Immigration accelerated as European peasants learned they could own vast farms in America and work them with mechanical efficiency their ancestors could never have imagined. But perhaps most importantly, McCormick's revolution had broken the ancient cycle that had governed human civilization since the dawn of agriculture. For 10,000 years, the vast majority of people had been farmers, because feeding humanity required enormous amounts of human labor. McCormick's machines changed that fundamental equation. Suddenly, a small percentage of the population could feed everyone else, freeing the majority to pursue education, arts, science, industry, and dreams that had been impossible when survival required most people to spend most of their time growing food. Cyrus McCormick had started with a simple goal: to build a machine that could harvest grain more efficiently than human hands. He ended up rebuilding human civilization itself. But even as McCormick was laid to rest in Chicago's Graceland Cemetery, the seeds of transformation he had planted were still growing, still changing the world in ways he could never have imagined. Cyrus McCormick died in his Chicago mansion on May 13, 1884, but his revolution had only begun. To understand the true magnitude of what this Virginia farm boy had unleashed upon the world, we need to follow the ripple effects of his mechanical reaper as they spread through American society and beyond, transforming not just how people worked, but how they lived, learned, and dreamed about the future. Let me tell you about Giuseppe Torino, an Italian immigrant who arrived at Ellis Island in 1890 with nothing but calloused hands, a strong back, and desperate ambition. In the old country, Giuseppe's family had farmed 20 acres for generations, 20 acres that required every family member working from dawn to dusk just to survive. Children started fieldwork as soon as they could walk. Education was a luxury for the wealthy. The cycle of back-breaking agricultural labor seemed eternal and inescapable. But America in 1890 was a different world, transformed by McCormick's revolution. Giuseppe used his savings to purchase a homestead claim in Kansas, 300 acres of prairie grassland that would have been impossible for any family to work with traditional methods. Then, he bought a McCormick reaper on the installment plan that Cyrus had pioneered decades earlier. Think about what this meant. One man, one machine, 300 acres. Giuseppe could harvest more grain in a single season than his entire extended family had produced in Italy across multiple generations. But more importantly, his children, instead of spending their days bent over in wheat fields, could attend the one-room schoolhouse that had been built in their farming community. This multiplication was happening across America. Farm children, freed from harvest duties by mechanical efficiency, were pursuing education in unprecedented numbers. Rural schools multiplied like wildflowers after spring rain. By 1900, Literacy rates in farming communities had skyrocketed compared to just 50 years earlier. And here's something that would have astonished earlier generations. Women were entering colleges, universities at rates that seemed revolutionary. Sarah Chen's daughters remember Sarah, the Nebraska widow, whose letter to McCormick we read earlier. Both became teachers. One eventually earned a degree from a state university, something that would have been unthinkable in a world where harvest time required every available hand, regardless of gender. The transformation went deeper than economics or even education. McCormick's reaper had ended what we might call the 10,000-year tyranny of the harvest, that brief, desperate window when a family's entire year of survival hung in the balance of a few weeks of frantic labor. For all of human history, agricultural societies had lived in terror of harvest failure. Miss that narrow window, and you starved. With mechanical harvesting, that ancient fear began to fade. Farmers could plan beyond the next meal, beyond the next season. They could think about improvements, expansions, investments in their children's education. For the first time since the dawn of agriculture, human beings could look toward the future with confidence, rather than constantly worrying about immediate survival. Cities exploded with former farm workers who became teachers, doctors, inventors, artists, and entrepreneurs. The same hands that once wielded scythes now operated factory machinery, wrote books, performed surgery, and built the infrastructure of modern America. McCormick's mechanical revolution had created something entirely new in human history, a society where the majority of people were freed from food production to pursue other endeavors. Consider this staggering fact. In 1800, roughly 90% of Americans worked in agriculture. By 1900, that number had dropped to less than 40%, and it was still falling. McCormick's reaper hadn't just changed farming, it had fundamentally altered what it meant to be human in the modern world. The moral implications were equally profound. McCormick's machines made American slavery economically obsolete, long before the Civil War ended it politically. Why own expensive humans when machines could work more efficiently and didn't require food, shelter, or medical care? The reaper didn't cause abolition, but it made the economic argument for slavery increasingly difficult to sustain. In the American South, planters who had invested fortunes in human property watched mechanical efficiency make their business model outdated. A single reaper could harvest more cotton or grain than dozens of enslaved workers, and it never got sick, never ran away, never required the massive infrastructure of housing, feeding, and controlling human beings. By 1900, McCormick's original company had merged with other agricultural machinery manufacturers to form International Harvester, a corporate giant that dominated global agriculture. The crude 1831 prototype that had struggled through John Steele's Virginia wheat field had evolved into sophisticated combines that could cut, thresh, and clean grain in a single pass. But the evolution didn't stop there. Today's modern combines, the direct descendants of McCormick's revolutionary machine, can harvest more grain in 1 hour than 1,000 workers with scythes could cut in a week. GPS guidance systems ensure perfect efficiency. Computer sensors monitor grain quality in real time. Satellite technology helps farmers optimize every aspect of their operations. 7 billion humans eat today because one Virginia mountain man refused to accept that harvesting must break human backs. His mad idea didn't just change farming, it changed what it means to be human. Think about your own life for a moment. The fact that you're not spending 14 hours a day in agricultural labor, the fact that you had time to receive an education, the fact that you can pursue careers in technology or arts or science or any of 1,000 other fields, all of this traces back to mechanical innovations like McCormick's reaper that freed humanity from the ancient tyranny of subsistence agriculture. The grocery store where you buy food represents the endpoint of a revolution that began with young Cyrus McCormick sketching his design by candlelight in 1831. Those shelves, stocked with grain products from around the world, exist because mechanical harvesting made it possible for a tiny percentage of the population to feed everyone else. Modern universities, hospitals, research laboratories, technology companies, space programs, the entire edifice of contemporary civilization rests on the foundation of agricultural efficiency that McCormick helped create. When humans finally travel to Mars, they'll carry with them the legacy of that Virginia farm boy who dared to imagine that machines could replace human muscle in the fields of Earth. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For 10 millennia, humans had lived with the knowledge that survival required most people to spend most of their time producing food. Children grew up expecting to follow their parents into agricultural labor. Social mobility was limited because society couldn't afford to have too many people pursuing non-agricultural activities. McCormick's revolution shattered those ancient constraints. Suddenly, a farmer's son could become a doctor, a lawyer, an inventor, or an artist without worrying that his choice would leave people hungry. A farmer's daughter could attend university, pursue a career, or start a business because mechanical efficiency had made her labor in the fields unnecessary. The ripple effects continue today. Every smartphone app, every medical breakthrough, every work of art or literature, every scientific discovery, all of it is possible because we live in a world where feeding humanity no longer requires the majority of people to work in agriculture. Cyrus McCormick stood in his father's blacksmith shop in 1831, surrounded by the wreckage of failed dreams, and imagined a machine that could liberate humans from back-breaking labor. What he created was far more than a mechanical reaper. He created the foundation of modern civilization itself. The next time you eat a meal without thinking about where the grain came from or how it was harvested, remember that young Virginia man who refused to accept the ancient limits of human possibility. His mad idea didn't just change harvest methods, it changed the entire trajectory of human history. And the revolution continues. In laboratories around the world, scientists and engineers are working on new agricultural technologies that would astonish even McCormick: vertical farms in skyscrapers, robotic systems that can identify and harvest individual fruits, genetic modifications that could feed billions more people with even less human labor. The boy who sketched his first reaper design by candlelight could never have imagined where his revolution would lead. But he understood something timeless about human nature. We are not meant to spend our lives bent over in endless toil. We are meant to dream, to create, to explore, to reach beyond the immediate demands of survival toward something greater. McCormick's mechanical reaper was just the beginning. The real harvest, the harvest of human potential that his revolution made possible, is still growing, still ripening, still waiting to be gathered by future generations who will build upon his foundation in ways we cannot yet imagine.